This is part of our spring 2022 webinar series, examining counseling systems that maintain oppressive practices of multiracial non-binary clients. I want to welcome 3 amazing doc students from our program. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So MK, you're the first one on the list, so I'll let you start with you and turn it over to y'all, and I'm just here to support you. Okay.
Thanks so much, Dr. Stretch. It's great to get to see a lot of faces that we don't usually get to see. But I'm MK. I am a second-year doc student, background mostly in substance use. I'm very interested in queer theories and radical kind of pedagogies, and supporting the margin.
Philippa, you want to go next?
Hello, everybody. I'm Philippa Chin. I'll spare you the details, but I'm a doctoral student too. We're all in the same year, second year, about to prepare our dissertation soon. So we're in the thick of it. Thank you for having us here tonight. A lot of my research interest is in racial identity, including the experiences of multiracial individuals. So thank you, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Aishwarya. My pronouns are she, her. I'm also a second-year doctoral student, and we are excited to have you all here on a Saturday evening. Thank you for spending it with us. So our presentation will be looking at examining counseling systems that maintain oppressive practices of multiracial and non-binary clients. Okay, so who we are. So as we said in our introductions, we are all doctoral students in the Counsel Ed program at William & Mary, specifically second-year doctoral students. So the identities we talk about in this webinar or presentation are important to us for 2 reasons. So the first being 2 of us personally identify as either non-binary or multiracial. And the second reason is that all of us have worked or are currently working with clients who identify as multiracial, non-binary, and/or both. We would really love it if you would like to connect with us. Please don't hesitate to reach out. These are our emails, and we can always share them at the end of the presentation as well if you have further questions or would just like to connect with us to get to know us a little bit better. So a couple of things that we would like to say as a disclaimer for this presentation. The first is that the knowledge shared in this slide and the coming slides cannot be generalized for every multiracial, non-binary client or individual. Please remember that within group differences exist. So we hope that this information is just a starting point in your journey and is by no means exhaustive. So just like you, we are also learning. By no means are we experts. And we would invite you all to share your questions or maybe knowledge that you have that maybe we don't have at the end of the presentation. We would ask if you can keep all your questions and comments towards the end, or if you'd like, you can put them in the chat, because I know sometimes things will come up in the presentation and then you'll forget at the end. So you can drop them in the chat and then we will get to it at the end of the presentation. Lastly, we would also say that sometimes with these presentations, there might be feelings or emotions that arise for you as we talk. And that's completely fine. We want to normalize that, but we also ask that you explore those feelings that might come up during this presentation. And then I said lastly, but there's actually one more thing that I want to say. So in the presentation, there are going to be a couple of questions that we will pose to you as the audience. We would invite you to all have a pen or paper next to you or just your laptop as a Word document or notes. And if you can actually answer some of the questions that we pose in this webinar / presentation.
All right. So one of the first things that we want to talk about is language. So as stated right here, language, it never truly captures anyone's full experience. Language is restrictive in that way. And language is ever changing. Certainly the language that I knew of used to identify sexual identity or gender identity is very different from in my early 20s, even 30s to now in my late 40s. So language definitely changes. And it really would be behoove counselors in training, counselor educators, people who work in the clinical field to always be ahead of that, to always be looking at the most recent literature to make sure you're aware of that. So the first thing I'd like to highlight here is the acronym or the abbreviation 2SLGBTQIQA+. Spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, questioning, and asexual individuals. Again, it is interesting that we have gotten to a point where we can have more words, more language, to more labels, even to identify people's way of being or how they wish to be. But there's still binary within this. What that means is that in some way or the other, you are forced to choose a label, pick a label to identify who or how or where or you want to be. And even using those words, who or how, can be restrictive in that way. And I do recognize that. The other language I like to consider is multiracial. You know, even within the three of us, we spoke about it. We spoke about the word biracial. And for wants and purposes of this presentation, we will include the biracial experience and the biracial identity under multiracial. Multiracial has been described as a multiracial individual can be somebody that identifies as two or more races. At least that's how it's out in the literature. So we'll use you'll hear of the terms biracial, interracial, mixed race. Again, it is really up to us as counselors in training, counselor educators, clinicians to be on top of what the new language, what the extended language is. So one of the things that we put here is, especially in the clinical space, you don't want to use the binary language. You want to be careful of not putting a label on someone. So one of the questions you could ask is, as they have it right here, I have an understanding of what this clinically or socially has been described as, but I'm curious as to what your experience of this is. A great question for a clinician to ask and just sit back and hopefully the client or clients will be willing to share that experience with you. Okay, so who are multiracial, non-binary individuals? So again, for this presentation, we are actually looking at people who describe as multiracial and non-binary, or people who identify as multiracial, or people who identify as non-binary. In this case, I will be speaking about multiracial and non-binary just for some sort of definition, as much as the language allows us to do that. So for multiracial individuals, and as I said, we're including biracial here, it really is an act of self-categorization. It's a purposeful act to categorize yourself. It also is a chance to affirm your heritage to one or two races. So in this case, if someone identifies as multiracial, the situation may be it's a developmentally significant situation where they would have to really think about race, the social construct of race. They have to think of ancestry, heritage, culture, and they have to choose to identify these two or more races, versus someone who may identify as monoracial, meaning they see themselves as as purely white or purely Black or, whatever other racial categories we can think of, they don't necessarily have to think so much about it. It doesn't make it wrong, but that developmental piece is not necessarily there. For a non-binary individual, and this is actually great what we have here, non-binary individuals' gender identity lies outside of the boundaries of the strict male and female binary. They may identify as both male and female, neither male or female, or somewhere in between. So a non-binary person's gender identity lies outside of the boundaries of a strict male-female dichotomy. As a gender identity, it's sort of independent of this biology, it's male, female, intersex, and the sexual orientation, whether it's heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, it's outside of those boundaries. It's outside of the language that those words generate. And non-binary individuals are considered gender minorities. Something to think about, especially when we talk about marginalized populations. So throughout this, I think Ashwari already mentioned this, but throughout the presentation, we will be asking you questions just to reflect on. So if you have something to write it on, but this is the first question. What comes up for you when you think of multiracial, non-binary, and someone who identifies as both? Okay, why is this important? Why are we even spending our Saturday night talking about this? So let's go a little bit into this. Modeling. Again, tonight, I think we have a great group of people. We may have some counselor trainees, some clinicians, active clinicians, maybe some counselor educators here, other people who are connected to, are very interested in the field. But it's very important to model the inclusive and right behavior for the non-binary and multiracial population. So the existing counseling curriculum and the existing theories or the existing clinical theories that are most often used doesn't necessarily include this population. And unfortunately, because of language, we talked about how language can be restrictive. It actually enforces the marginalization of this population. So that's something to be very aware of, and model the right behavior where you actually use inclusive language, use the right language when you speak to these individuals, or you even speak about individuals in this way. It's also important because you may have forced identity scenarios. So this looks like initial paperwork in the practice, right? Intake forms, insurance forms, where they ask for gender. What's your agenda? What's your gender? Male or female? I'll share with you, Ashwarya, MK, and myself literally are going to a conference next month. I'll call it out, Delta Airlines. We're booking the flight, and we had to put down a gender identity, and the options were male or female. So this is a great example of a forced identity scenario, but it does happen in the clinical space too. It could also even be, you may have seen it even in your application to some colleges. You may have seen that you were forced to identify. Certainly for multiracial individuals, that could happen. You could have the categories of white, African-American, Asian, Hispanic, non-white, Hispanic, white. Where does that leave somebody who's multiracial? Sometimes they have other, but that within itself is just so vague. It's very vague. It feels less than in that moment. So, and which really blends well into the next reason why it's important, because this population of non-binary, multiracial individuals, they do suffer a lot of marginalization and a lot of experiences where they are ignored. Not only in the situation where you're forced to identify, but their experiences may not necessarily be spoken about explicitly in the clinical space or even in the curriculum, in the classroom. Like that specific experience is not there. And of course, there's a wide variety of experience, but you may not see yourself there. So it's something to really consider, especially in the clinical space too. Like, how do you bring their experiences into the space and honor that? There are high numbers, unfortunately, when we talk about mental health issues, there are high numbers of non-binary and multiracial individuals who do experience overall psychological distress. That shows up a lot in anxiety, depression, all sorts of depression. Align this with any trauma in their childhood or any other sort of traumatic experiences. And unfortunately, we have a lot of distress there. And then let me talk again briefly, talk about the accessibility of language. We spoke briefly about that. Identity takes longer to articulate for non-binary, fluid, or non-monolithic identities. Now, this doesn't mean that someone doesn't know who they are. But again, the language is not necessarily available or accessible for an individual to explain this, nor in some cases should they. Okay.
Okay, so if you don't believe us, at least you should believe our profession. So some of you might already be familiar with this if you took an ethics class and if you've looked at the KCARP standards, but I'm just going to go over it one more time. So KCARP has delineated in their standards that there should be an understanding of social and cultural diversity as part of your development as part of your development for your professional counseling identity. The ACA Code of Ethics also emphasized the role of multiculturalism and diversity throughout the therapeutic relationship, and do not and ensure that you do not engage or condone discrimination towards clients. The next thing is also avoiding imposition of values, avoiding harm, and being aware of your own personal values while you are becoming a counselor, right? So making sure that when you are providing services to clients, that you are also doing your own work throughout this process. And then finally, ACA also emphasizes the role of social justice and accounts for diversity, equity, and inclusion in their core values.
Okay. So the next kind of reflection question we'd like you to consider, how might you include a client's multiracial, non-binary identity in the counseling space? Whether you're first year student just in practicum, you've been practicing for 30 years, you're jumping back into it. Are there spaces now you can think of where in your practice that you can start inviting a little more inclusion around these identities? So, and I will caveat this. When we say traditional counseling theories, what I'm going to go into, whenever I see presentations like this, I love the theoretical stuff. I love learning like some of the bigger things. And then I wonder what it's going to look like on Monday when I show up to work or I show up to counseling. Like, what's something I can pull right now? When we use the word traditional counseling theories, the ones that we've seen the most, gone in the most depth in a theories class. I know in theories, a lot of us get a little bit of this, a little bit of that. For a lot of counseling programs, person-centered theory and cognitive behavioral theory tend to be the two that I think a lot of students gravitate towards. They're also the ones that a lot of sites will end up using. CBT, right? Very evidence-based. There's more funding for CBT. There's insurance-led CBT. It's big out there. So we chose these two, not because these are the only two that we think that y'all are using, that people are using, but because we see these often. If you're wondering where to start including some of this in practice, We took a look at person-centered theory and cognitive behavioral theory to see if there are some little places we can kind of start cracking that door a little wider open. So with person-centered, it's really right. Person-centered starts with an awareness of a clinician's own assumptions. With that, like Philip Aishwarya said, that continuing to look towards your own training, identifying gaps. It's not that like I feel bad that I didn't know this. It's okay. Wow, I've learned about something new, or I've learned that I need to keep learning about this. How do I keep widening that door? Do I seek out trainings? Am I looking towards different kinds of literature? I might, even if I think I've never met a person like this, chances are you have, right? These are people who exist all around us all the time, who hold different identities. And part of our job as a counselor is to invite that whole person into the room. So maybe if you like looking through client files, you're like, well, I've never met one. Some problematic language issues, but I've never met somebody who identifies like this. I think that next question is, have I created a space where they know that they're welcome? Because chances are you probably have met someone who might not have disclosed it yet, or is in the process of figuring out their language. It doesn't mean you did something like intentionally harmful. It just means, what can we do next with this? With that person-centered, really honing in on, where am I standing with this kind of information? Do I need more psychoeducation? Do I need some more experiential? What can I do to kind of prepare myself more as this counselor? With that, we know person-centered, non-directive, the client takes it in directions, really utilizing intake paperwork and really utilizing the introductory session where you're explaining your own values as a counselor, or what you include on your website, on your LinkedIn, however you're kind of advertising who you are. But introducing space in the beginning that demonstrates these are important topics to you. So even if you personally practice from a really non-directive place, setting that table at the beginning that people know you're a space this can be brought up in. Looking at CBT, there's a lot here. CBT, let me rewind my thought. We do know from research that individuals from marginalized statuses are socialized to not talk about experiences of marginalization, particularly to individuals who don't identify with the same marginalized status. So when we talk really about being really explicit in inviting in discussions around identity, inclusive identity, non-binary, even if we're really proud of putting in work of being an inclusive therapist, like it's a safe space, we know from research that sometimes unless things are really explicitly brought up, people from more marginalized spaces do not feel comfortable bringing it up. Like you might see like a safe space sticker. But even within that group, or within like a pride flag, someone who's non-binary might not know how they fit into that. So when you are the therapist, whether you're trying to really operate from an egalitarian place, the therapist holds so much power, particularly in the first few sessions. Even if you identify as part of the same marginalized community as your client does, you still there's a power imbalance there. You're part of something a little bit more dominant. You're part of an established structure. So with that client, with that clinician who will hold more power and privilege in the counseling relationship, particularly in the earlier days, really important that the counselor initiates conversations from the get-go. With CBT, we look at so much of modifying like cognitive restructuring techniques. That's such a big part of those interventions. It's what so many people love about CBT, particularly clinicians who are like, okay, what do we do? Where do we go with this? With that, when we talk about modifying cognitive restructuring techniques, it's individuals from marginalized groups often have negative and automatic thoughts that are not irrational given experiences, right? If someone discloses to you that they're feeling like everybody at work is watching them, waiting for them to mess up, or thinks that they're less than or less capable. A typical CBT question might be, well, like, what's your evidence for this? What's the evidence for this? Is this a rational thought? Like, let's unpack it. But if this is somebody from a more marginalized community, there's a very strong chance that what they're experiencing is absolutely true, or it's reflective of other experiences that they've had. So if you're using CBT in a more inclusive manner, not targeting the internalization of heteronormative or racist or oppressive structures, but rather than the experiences themselves. They're not the question of like, do you have evidence that this is really happening? But this is happening. How is this shaping your perception of yourself? How does this shape your own self-belief or your thoughts about your worth? So it's taking that model of CBT. It's not saying CBT doesn't work. It's just saying there's different ways we can structure this to make sure we don't invalidate experiences people when someone from a marginalized group shares experience they've had. You don't target the experience or question their perception of it. You seek to understand how it's impacting their day-to-day. Okay. Okay. And so we also know that it can be difficult, right? We get like one theories class in a master's program. We also get one theories class in a doc program. There's so much space to learn. There are so many theories out there, and there are so many other models of counseling, right? You get the Reader's Digest of a lot of it during your one program, and then there's that impetus on you as you get your license, as you move forward in the field, to keep learning, to keep finding theories that align more with you and the clients that you're working with. When we're looking at some more culturally responsive theories that really work with some of this. Some suggestions, if you're interested in this, or you want to see how you might really love person-centered, but how to integrate in some other perspectives and other types of lenses. Some suggestions, and I know I heard of feminist theory in my master's program, but I did not hear about the other two. When I found out about them, and I was like, this is awesome. This would speak to a lot of experiences. I wish I'd known about this earlier on, but I know about it now. Queer affirming theory. It weaves together theories from queer, trans, and queer person of color theories. They question dominant narratives, binary structures, pathologies, interventions, and care. There are some really in-depth kind of breakdowns of different interventions done by queer affirming therapists. So resisting static identities. Philippa mentioned when she was talking about language that like there's not always a word that exists for the experience someone's having of themselves. So even if at the beginning of a conversation, the closest word that they might have in counseling is non-binary, allowing clients to shift and to continue to understand and redefine themselves. So do we talk about it just at the intake and then do we leave it, or do we step in and help resist some of the static identities, resist some of that binary thought process? Because like, well, you told me you were this at the beginning, so I've been operating like this. Checking in with the client. So, checking in with the client about identities regularly, just like with questions like, just wanted to check back in, make sure I'm using the right language and I've got it right. How does it feel today that I'm thinking of you as queer identified? Does that sound right to you? That offers a space for someone to challenge, like they might have shifted their perception of themselves. They might not know that's how you think of them. It opens up a space to have a really real conversation and to let them know that this is important. It also gives them time to say, I don't want to talk about that right now, but you put that power back with the clients. We need other interventions from queer affirming theory, just mapping out meanings of client relationships, gather knowledge from clients about what family means to them when we talk about support systems and therapy. And there's a space in queer affirming theory for acknowledging macro and micro oppressive systems. So there is some systems talk in this, that understanding that where someone lives, how they grew up, where they're working, but there's a lot going on for people, and a lot of their identity intersects with that all the time. So bringing in space to explicitly name systems that might be really harmful to them. We live in a pretty politically charged climate. There's a lot of legislation going around and a lot of rhetoric going around, and queer affirming theory asks that you bring the real world in. It helps clients know that you know what's going on in the world around you and that it's affecting them. Feminist theory, right, affirms and attends to the experiences of historically marginalized groups and embraces human diversity. In this, the power in the therapeutic power in this type of therapeutic relationship is seen as egalitarian and collaborative. And regardless of theoretical orientation you primarily use, feminist tenets can be integrated. And it's through this lens that one can kind of transform a practice. So with this, right, like a lot of us follow kind of integrative models of counseling, right? Stuff that works here, fits with who I am, fits with the client in front of me. There's a lot in feminist theory that can really strengthen the work that you do in a therapeutic relationship. Feminist theory, there's a lot of narrative work, there's a lot of examining structures, and there's a lot of that, how do we get power back into a client's hands? And we're working with persons who have been historically marginalized, historically excluded, to the point where like, you know, right, you don't even have a word for me, how could you include me? These spaces, how do we find, feminist theory looks a lot at how do we find places of empowerment? And then relational cultural theory. We grow through the relationships throughout one's lives. There's so much here that involves, all of this really involves the person as the counselor. But there's authenticity, there's mutual empathy, and RCT will really emphasize fluid expertise, and that both people in the relationship have the expertise they use to move the treatment forward. So there's a lot of that space of, I'm the expert of myself, and I approach situations with other people in that space of not knowing. But together we can share, and together continue to move forward in this relationship. So again, we're not saying one of these is going to be better than anything else, but there are, if you've wondered how something can fit into the practice that you're developing, that there are people who develop models all the time, develop case studies, but there are different ways of informing the theories that are most comfortable with you to better serve the clients in front of you. And I've talked a lot, and I'm sorry, I've got this gravelly voice. This last reflection question, do you see any barriers in implementing strategies? Barriers can be from a lot of different places. And the follow-up to that, what can you do to overcome them?
My finger slipped and then I hit the next button. But we are now towards the end of our presentation. So this is the point where we would answer your questions, and we would invite you all to share anything that you wrote down to the questions that we posed throughout the presentation. So the first one was how might you include a client's multiracial, non-binary identity in the counseling space? What comes up for you when you think of multiracial, non-binary, and someone who identifies as both? Oh, we have someone in the waiting room. And what barriers do you foresee in implementing these strategies, and what can you do to overcome them?
No, sure. I would say let's start with the first one and just let's have a space, create that space for that discussion.
That's perfect. So anyone who feels comfortable to share, no pressure. We understand that some of you may not feel comfortable, and that's totally fine.
I think about on intake forms, there was a sample one I saw recently with it just had an open-ended space. So it wasn't in that survey format. And it does take away from that piece you mentioned on the othering aspect that can have its own pieces. But then I suppose, does that, I guess, one can overthink that very easily and think, well, does that look just callous of do the work for me? And I guess that's not necessarily true, but who am I to make that decision as well?
I was waiting for you to answer because that was your thing. Did you want to say anything?
I didn't hear you, Aishwarya.
Oh, can you both hear me?
What did you just say?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. What did you just say?
Did my audio go off? No, I was going to see if anyone wanted to add to what Jerry said.
Well, Jerry, it sounded like you were making a like us, you're just seeing kind of what's happening out there. I wonder if you're wondering if there can be change or what the change would be.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know that in the resources, which is actually on the next slide, I know that ACA has been working on competencies for people who identify who have all these labels. And I don't know if it's confusing things more or making things easier, but definitely in the next slide, they are trying to develop this. However, I think with our field, we have so many outside factors that we have to challenge and continue to challenge. And that's even insurance companies. That's a huge fight within itself. And just society at large, how they label things. So one of the opportunities we do have as counselors is to take up leadership positions. So we can be an ACA, we can vote, we can go out there, we can advocate for this change instead of necessarily just observing it and going, we don't like it. But this is definitely a social justice issue. At least that's what we think it is. I hope that helps, Jerry.
And I think I heard a little bit of the, like, okay, well, we'll take like the check boxes off, but now you still have to do the work of explaining your experience to me right now, like educating me about it. I think so much of this, right? Every individual is going to come to this so differently. So you're going to meet someone who's right, who's going to work with someone who's non-binary, who doesn't mind at all if it just says male, female, non-binary. And you might work with someone who really is like, no, it's not other, it's not the third, it's beyond this. Like, this is your spectrum and I'm on another galaxy. Like, that's how I understand where I sit. So I think that next portion of like, it's re-examining and adjusting things like intake paperwork. So not like, oh, it was 5 years ago, we'll redo it next year. We do it every few years. But adjusting as to how clients might interact with it, and then continuing to not letting just the intake be the only space where you talk about it. So you could ask about that process of intake. Is there anything you would change about this form? That might be the, an addendum, or after your first intake session. Would there be anything you would change about the process of how you come into this space? Which again, there's a tiny bit there still of like, tell me what, like, do a little bit of my work for me. But I think making it clear that this is important can go a really long way. I'm seeing so much good stuff pop off in the
Yeah, I was going to read some of it. So Susan said that she's gotten used to introducing herself as with her own pronouns, and that she tries to normalize that space for that. And then Joanna says, as a future school counselor, I would have some imagery in the office that would speak strongly to supporting multiracial, non-binary students. So those are some things. And then Susan has a concern about a client in telehealth who is an adolescent and identifies in both of these communities. They have one supportive parent and one less so not. When they take their telehealth appointment in shared space, I noticed a significant change in their level of openness around this ongoing discussion.
Yeah, so Susan, I'm not too sure where you are in your wonderful journey as a counselor, but definitely the piece that MK was talking about exploring maybe the counseling strategies or the counseling theories that you're using may help. It's also interesting because it sounds like you're doing not individual, but some sort of family therapy. Systems therapy is not very inclusive of these identities. So it might be stealing a little bit from other theories to help here. So I wonder if this case, do the parents know? Or are the parents in denial? I'm not too sure.
And Susan, if you're comfortable, you can come on off mute.
I'm comfortable. My dogs are jerks, so I think the moment they could just lose their mind again, I don't know what their problem is. I'm comfortable. So my issue becomes that that mom knows and is supportive, but dad has outright said, I'm not calling you by any other name until you turn 18. You can change your name when you're 18. And that's, you know, it makes me a little bit edgy. So I have sent some info, some psychoeducation, a counselor in the LGBTQ space in this area has sent out some like Trans 101 and some parenting on non-binary teen support groups that they're starting in their practice. So I sent that information to mom, but I haven't even had a conversation with dad. He doesn't join in any of the check-ins that I do. And right now, my supervisor and I are just strategizing on how to get the information to him and how to convince him that he should come talk to us at some point as a check-in. I really want to make sure that this adolescent that I'm seeing is getting support at a level that they deserve. I don't want to countermand the parents, of course, but I also don't want to normalize in any way the way that their father is responding to them and their change. So I guess, so what I'm looking at is as how are ways that I can continue to encourage this young adult, this young person to use their voice and to stand up for themselves without having them come into a space where they're back talking or smart mouthing their father or their grandfather who's also in a space. So I'm somewhat, I was desperate to get to this session because I wanted to hear a lot of what was said.
First, thank you for taking this much care with this adolescent and for recognizing that they are presenting a little bit differently with you, or a lot differently with you. So thank you for taking that care, first off. With mom being supportive, that's such a wonderful thing in this and nothing to be discounted. So having mom as that ally or having mom as that space. But I imagine there are probably other people here, anyone who's doing school counseling, anyone who's working with children, that this is probably hitting for some other people too. You know, if you're a school counselor at a religious school, you might have your hands tied by certain kinds of policies. If you're working with kids whose parents don't know, or I don't know, in Virginia, we had a case where a teacher kept, at a public school, kept misgendering a student, had been fired for it, and then appealed. The decision was reinstated at the school where he continues to misgender students. Like this is the reality for a lot of teenagers, for a lot of kids. How do we balance our obligations to their whole person while also keeping them safe, the most safe? So I think continuing to talk to your supervisor through this, working with the parent who is on board, and sussing out safety for this student. If you know I'm hesitant to give like straight up advice because I don't know, the student advice is not helpful typically. But continuing to explore the student's idea of safety. Are you providing that safe space every time, whether sometimes their dad's in earshot so they can't say everything they would, or they're at mom's house and they can say what they'd like to. But if they know that you're that space they can keep coming back to, then does that suit how you feel as a counselor?
Mhm.
Does anyone, and this is open, I'm 100% not the only person with ideas on this.
I was just gonna share, wait, I wanna see where Susan is because my cursor is fighting me. Hi, Susan. So I think one of the things, and I completely agree with MK, even going off of that safety piece of it with the client, and it sounds like you do the sessions with the parents in the same space, is that correct?
They're in the house. Both mom and dad work remotely. So when the client gets home from school, they tend to take counseling in a shared space. So like in the living room. Mom and dad are supposed to be upstairs in their offices, but I get this terrible reluctance from the client whenever they've only taken session in their bedroom one time, and it was like word vomit. It was just everything. And then at one point there was a freeze, and they said, Dad just walked in to check on me. And what part of this should be this child's safe space and leave them alone? So I'm struggling. It's a wonderful client, a good kid, but I want to be able to be that warm and affirming place and safe place. But again, it's a child, and it's,
Yeah.
there's certain things I can't do because mom and dad.
Mhm. So I think one of the things that's coming to my mind, and you can use this or you can completely scrap it. It's totally up to you, and also what your relationship is like with the client and the parents. Is also setting boundaries with the client's parents and having a conversation on what that would look like when you are having sessions with the adolescent. Sometimes that can be tricky because some parents may not be happy with that. But that's also your part as a clinician, right? Like, you are also an advocate. So for the client to feel safe in sharing in that space, it might be helpful to have a conversation with the parents on what boundaries look like in terms of when they can come into a session, when they shouldn't be. And that also might give the client some room to be able to share and feel more comfortable. The other thing that was coming up for me was using a safe word. So when the client has an idea that, oh, like dad's about to come in, like you and the client having a safe word, so that they can use that in session. So okay, I shouldn't ask that question, or I need to change the topic now. And that way it gives the client some power. And that kind of goes back to some of the culturally responsive theories that we've been using, that we talked about in session, is always giving power back to your client and making sure that they're steering the ship. Does that make sense, Susan?
Absolutely. Thank you. I like both of those ideas. Thank you very much.
And not to take away from the wonderful expertise we have here, but as a professor, I would like to just highlight Professor Chamberlain's comments in the chat too. I think those are really helpful. And also to say that, part of what we're also doing with this particular student, Susan, is helping them navigate the realities of world. Right? This is the reality of their world. They're going to be working with individuals who are supportive and affirming, and they're going to be working with people who are not, and helping them navigate that in a healthy way is really powerful. Really, and just giving them the space to process that. And I don't want to take away by sharing, but one day I can share the story about one of the students I worked with, and just how creating that affirming space, even though it may be this tiny, tiny little space that they have, how affirming that can be long-term. So.
I think LaShawna, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I wanted to know, what about nonverbal cues? Would she be open, or he open, to maybe nonverbal cues, or writing a letter to maybe the parent to kind of have a conversation, or, not to dim down their being disrespectful, in a way to be as respectful as possible? I mean, it's just the idea.
Yeah, no, I think so. I was waiting for Susan to say something because I feel like that was direct.
Sorry. No, I was nodding yes, but I'm trying to figure out exactly how much confrontation the client is willing to accept with dad on this.
Right.
Given that they've spoken up for themselves once, and then when they spoke up for themselves to their grandparents, they were told that they were being a smart aleck for misgendering them. And so, I'm trying to figure out where their line is, and how. And one of the reasons, I don't want to say too much, but one of the things that they have issues with is anger management. So I don't want to put them in a situation where they're going to be forced into confrontation, and then, that we've been doing in other areas.
And Susan, one of the things that, as a parent of a trans identifying child, I would say that remember too, the parents need to go through their own developmental process.
Right.
You know, as affirming as I would have liked to thought I was before my child came out as trans, you know, I will tell you that it was very different being an ally and being a parental, capital A, capital L, capital L, capital Y, right? There was this shift, this change that happened for me, but I had to go through, and I was actually, I'll be very transparent, I was surprised by the amount of grief work that I had to do in that process. And everybody has different ways of handling that. And I think sometimes parents, some parents feel like I can't do this work because it's going to appear as if I'm not affirming my child. And some parents avoid doing that work because they don't want to go through the grief. And so just, I think, you know, at the same time, we have to create that space for the student or for the, you know, for your client. We also need to understand the parents are going through their own process. So how can we meet the parent where the parent is and help the parent move to the next step? Because for that father that you're describing, right, I can't take that person from here to here in one step, right? It has to be a process that happens over time and with education and support. And the way the education you give that father is going to be very different than the education you give the mother.
Right.
Just sorry to interrupt. Just
No, that's good. And that, as you know, Dr. LA, I am also the parent of a trans child and another child who's gay. So, you know, I'm in the capital, all caps, you know, caps lock ALLY category. So I tend to get a little bit more reactive whenever parents aren't supportive than probably the average parent does.
And recognizing that countertransference is awesome.
Thanks.
I think, and then finally, like, and you are in, I think about practicum, right? So like leaning on your supervisor, if it's supervisor, someone like really, you know, giving you some support on this. Like it's not going to be your job to change mom or dad's mind about anything. Like your job is to support this adolescent in the best ways that you can that keeps them as safe as possible. So working closely with your supervisor, working on this. I think the point's kind of about boundaries, revisiting confidentiality. Like the parents are letting their child come to counseling. And that's a huge first step for a lot of families. So like, okay, you're doing this, it's clear you love your child. I want this to be as successful as possible for them, as effective as possible. Can we talk a little bit about some ground rules that I think might help this? So that you don't have to explicitly talk about anything the child's bringing up to you or the adolescent's bringing up, but just, hey, we all want the same thing here, and you're already doing that first hardest thing, which is letting them talk to somebody outside. That might be a step, but yeah.
Sorry, but I didn't mean to hog the conversation.
Yeah. I get the sense that this is something, I mean, this is something, again, anyone who's working with a minor, anybody who's working with someone under a guardianship or in a school system, this is going to come up. This is going to come up. So navigating the very real systems that people live in, that students, that children, that adolescents live in. I think helpful for all of us.
Anything else that's coming up for anyone in the audience? I'm also mindful of time. I know we have like 6 minutes left. So I see the chat. My Corsa's, I'm the one sharing my screen. So if my Corsa is being weird, it's me. Oh, here we go. Dr. Chamberlain. Thanks everyone for like writing in the chat and engaging with us. Anyone else wants to share anything that came up with the questions that we posed?
So one of the questions where it talks about what barriers do you foresee in implementing these strategies, and what can you do to overcome them when a child is having trouble expressing to their parents or trying to come out for the first time, what would be some strategies, I guess, to help them to implicate that?
Mhm. It's a really good question. I think the first thing that's coming up for me is, again, safety. And Philippa and MK, you can chime in too, but how safe is it for them to be able to share that with their parents? I'm wondering, let me see what Lashona is. Lashona, are you currently having a client right now who's experiencing that?
Well, I had a stepdaughter that was experiencing that situation,
Okay, thanks. For sharing.
and her father was not respectable at all about the decision that she made. So she felt like she could come to me about it, and trying to have a conversation with him about her is like, it was hard to even try to get him to listen. So
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Lashona.
absolutely.
I think the biggest thing for me is like that's coming up for me is like safety, right? Like
Mhm.
we want to always ensure with our clients that they are safe when they are, coming out and sharing their identity, and that it's not going to pose so much of a danger to them that they can't survive in their own household.
Mhm.
But also, I think it's tricky at the same time because you want them to be able to feel comfortable and confident in themselves, right?
Mhm.
Um, so that's a
I
really
mean, I provided her with some great
mhm,
strategies, I want to say, but I don't know if it was great for him. Does that make sense?
mhm,
Because, like, you can say great things to a person, but it may not come off to someone else that way. You just got to be careful with how you say something to someone, because you don't want to make the mistake to leave, or to leave off on a wrong tip or wrong situation. You want to make sure that everything is still good between you and your parent. Parents are important, so just being that one in the middle was like tough for me. I didn't push her away, and I think that's what he did. He pushed her away. So I just embraced her, talked to her, and just let her share whatever she wanted with me.
Right. And what you're talking about there, Lashana, is unconditional positive regard,
Yes, ma'am.
right? And that's the space.
Yes, ma'am.
Um,
I'm sorry I didn't say that, but yeah, you're correct. You're spot on. Sorry.
all right. So MK and Philippa and Ashara, is there some resources, something you were going to share as well? Because I know we've got 3 minutes. So just wanted
yes.
to be attentive.
And again, thank you, Lashona, for sharing and being vulnerable with us.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm sorry.
No apologies. That was wonderful.
Yeah. So we have a couple of resources that we wanted to share. I think Philippa or MK might have alluded to this already, the competencies that it's actually the citation is on one of the earlier slides, but if you just copy paste this into Google, it should come up with a huge PDF document that might be helpful for you in your practice. And then we also included some books that you can look into. So Life Isn't Binary, Beyond the Gender Binary, Half and Half, and Mixed Feelings, Poems and Stories. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. There's plenty of other resources that are that are available, but we just wanted to share a couple that we have seen and thought might be helpful. But yeah, with that, I think we will also be sharing this PowerPoint. Is that right, Dr. Stretch?
Yeah, if you can send me the PowerPoint, I'll be happy to post it in the program office and also in the YouTube. And I would also recommend LGBTQ resource centers in most communities. I want to just highlight that, as well as GLSEN and other wonderful Trevor projects, some wonderful things. And we have, if you're in Virginia, we have an incredible organization for trans individuals, Equality Virginia, and I just want to call them out because they just do amazing work. So just be curious, right? Be curious. Well, I would like to give a round of applause or snaps to our wonderful students here who've done a great job. Thank you so much for bringing this conversation to us. For those of you who might be interested in a CE certificate, did put the Qualtrics link in the chat, and I will put it again so that everybody can access that. And if you can fill that out in the next week, I do send those certificates out at the end of the semester. So I batch all of the CE certificates up at one time and send those out at once. So if you have any remaining questions, please let us know. Thank you again. I so appreciate the three of you. I enjoy working with you, collaborating, and just having you with us is awesome. So thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening and night, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Those were great questions, Susan. I think the real cases are help apply the concepts.
I felt like I was hogging the conversation. I'm sorry.
No, I think it was important because I think you give a real issue, people can really think through the nuances. It's not easy work, you know?
No. And the reason mom presented for counseling for the adolescent was completely not, we haven't touched on that hardly at all. So no.
What I always say is the presenting issue is not the issue that you need to work on.
Definitely not. Hasn't come anywhere near it.
All right.